This video is kindly sponsored by Payhip, so stay tuned until the end because I'm about to introduce you to a new platform that I use to create my website to sell knitting patterns. And the best part actually is that it's completely free. Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm here with a super fun video because today I will be talking about how to start selling knitting patterns part 2. So I made a part 1 of this video about 9 months ago in February of this year. So basically I've been selling knitting patterns for these past 9 months and also a tiny bit before that, and I hope this video is helpful for you, and without further ado, let's just get started. So the first thing to think about when you want to start selling knitting patterns is to start actually designing your knitting patterns. So the best thing is to start by finding existing knitting stitch patterns, or you can create your own. Of course, if you're going to create a stockinette garment or something very basic, you don't really need to do this. But I find a really good place to find knitting stitch patterns in garments that I already have in my wardrobe or that I find in stores, on Pinterest. There are also YouTube tutorials out there, on Instagram there are tutorials. And also in vintage knitting books, there are also specific knitting books that you can buy that show like techniques for intarsia, jacquard, like colorwork knitting, but also for lace knitting, for cable knitting. There are a lot of resources out there that you can find, and you can also create your own, which is a little bit more tricky, which I have done in the past, but it's not something that I recommend for someone just starting out because it can be a little bit tricky. But it is very fun to create something that is truly very unique and that has not been done before. And then after you created your design, it's time to start actually pattern developing. So you have to think about the construction ahead of time. Is this going to be a raglan sweater, a top-down or like bottom-up sweater construction? Then besides of course a raglan, you can do a drop shoulder, a circular yoke sweater, a contiguous shoulder, and there are of course a lot of other constructions that can be done as well. And I also like to think about the pleasurability of knitting the pattern. So for me, for example, I really like knitting something top down and in the round, and I know a lot of people feel the same. So I try to also include those types of techniques in my pattern, and I'm not suddenly going to design something that is knit bottom up and worked flat and like seamed together, for example, because that's just not something that I enjoy knitting. And then I highly recommend to start writing your pattern in the format that you're going to release the pattern. So for example, I design and create all of my patterns on Canva because I really like that it has so many different fonts and colors and just a lot of possibilities basically. So I actually also start writing my pattern in Canva, all of my pattern notes. I don't use like a specific or separate document for that. I just start straight in Canva, and I find that it really helps because then after you're done creating your pattern, you do not have to go back and convert it to the final format, and it really saves you a lot of time. And then also along those lines is to grade your pattern along the way. Now I actually have found some very nice resources on how to grade a pattern, which I will link down below because I recently started grading my patterns using spreadsheets, which I highly recommend. When I first started out, I didn't even know this was a thing. And it does seem very daunting and confusing, but it's actually really nice. But do keep in mind that designing knitting patterns is always quite mathematical, so you're gonna have to do math, you're gonna have to do calculations, you're gonna need some type of understanding on portions and how they will fit the body, and for that you just need math, and that's just how it is. So if that's really not something for you, then I don't really recommend starting this journey, but it is something to keep in mind, and the spreadsheets definitely will make it easier. So like I said, I will link those down below because it's a really nice resource. But despite this research that I found, you can also find books about grading in general for the body, so also for sewing patterns. But there are also pattern books where they really teach you how to create your own knitting pattern. So those books can also be very helpful. I don't really have any recommendations for those because I don't use them myself, but I will try to find some and link them down below. And then of course, after you've designed your sweater and made your pattern, kind of like you don't need to have the whole thing figured out, but then it's time to start actually knitting your pattern. And I would really recommend to think about the following. Is the yarn accessible? So price-wise, are people going to be able to afford it? Is it accessible in multiple places in the world? So is this something that is very local to you? Then I would not use that yarn for your sample, because then, you know, not a lot of people are going to be able to use the exact same yarn if they wanted to. And then also think about the color of the yarn. So really, of course, if it suits the design, but also is the stitch definition going to play out. So for example, a lighter color is always going to have better stitch definition than a darker color, and the same kind of goes for like the texture of the yarn. So a fluffy yarn is not going to have as much stitch definition as a yarn that is not as fluffy. And those are all really important things to keep in mind. You want the pattern to be accessible, but you also want it to appeal to other people. So basically the pictures are very important, so your sample is really important as well. Then after you've knitted your sample and made your pattern, you're going to send the pattern off to a tag editor, which is a very important step and not one to skip. And I would try to remove as many mistakes as possible. And one tip that I have for that is to really look at your consistency of your work. This is not something that I really thought about when I first started out making my own patterns. So for example, are you going to be saying use like 5mm needles, or are you going to say with 5mm needles? And it's okay to use one or the other, like switching throughout the pattern. So for example, a sweater pattern I have will say using, and then the other one is going to say with. The important thing is that you keep it consistent throughout that specific pattern. So you're not going to switch between like different ways to say something in the same pattern. And then another thing to consider is your writing style. Are you someone that really enjoys like a lot of text, or are you someone that enjoys the very concise type of patterns that have a lot of abbreviations? Then I think if you're, for example, the latter, then maybe you also want to make a pattern that is like that. So one that has a lot of abbreviations and not a lot of text explanation. That is all up to you and your personal preference, but it is something to keep in mind, and definitely also something that you want to have consistent across all of your patterns. And then after the pattern has been tag edited, it is time to start test knitting. And for test knitting, it's very sad, but it is best if you already have some type of social media following. So I would focus on one platform, because trying to do all of the social media platforms is very tricky. So I would, for example, focus on creating as much YouTube content as you can, or Instagram or TikTok, whichever platform you prefer. It is nice to try and build a following somewhere so that you can have a group of test knitters, but also of course a future customer base. Of course, you can also like release knitting patterns and make knitting patterns without a following. I don't think you necessarily need to have a following to be able to be successful, but it does really help. So that is something that I would recommend, and it will really help to start a test knit group as well. And then just like in my last video, I do recommend to kind of choose your standards for a test knit. So how inclusive is this test knit going to be? Are you only going to allow beginner knitters or advanced knitters? And also, what are you going to require from these test knitters? So I've seen actually people that require a certain number of Instagram followers. So if that's something that's very important to you, I'm not saying if it's good or bad, but then that is up to you to suggest something like that. Or are you going to have a very long time to test knit because you just want to make it as peaceful as an experience as possible for people? Then that's something you should keep in mind and try also to keep consistent over all of your test knits. And then the last and probably the most important part, besides your design, is all of the practical stuff. Like, how are you actually going to start selling your knitting patterns? So you need to think about the taxes and the legal stuff and the Chamber of Commerce and all of that boring stuff. But then also your branding and your logos, and what type of colors are you going to use? What type of fonts are you going to have? Then I would really recommend setting up a domain name, especially when you've started a business name. So for example, my business runs by Mipi the label. I've always had my domain name, even when I didn't use it. It is nice to just claim it so that nobody else gets it, because if they do, it's really hard and difficult to get it back, and you're gonna have to spend a lot of money, whilst a domain name probably costs like 10 euros a year. So I think it's worth the investment to just claim it and to have it as your own, especially after you've applied with that name to the Chamber of Commerce, because that name is yours. So you should claim it on all of the platforms and as many as you can. Then the same goes for a customer service email. So where are people going to reach you? For some website platforms, you can have an email or customer base throughout that platform. So for example, on Etsy, people can send you a message on Etsy. But it's still really nice to also create your own email besides that. So I personally just use a Gmail. I find that it works really well, and yeah, I just like it. And then the final point is, where are you going to be selling your knitting patterns? So there are a couple of options, and I'm going to be sharing 4 options with you today, starting with the most obvious option, which is Ravelry. So Ravelry is probably the most well-known database for knitting patterns and crochet patterns, and probably the one that everybody starts out on. Ravelry actually takes 3.5% of transaction fees on the entire amount of sales that you've made that month. But that only starts from $30, so if you've made less than $30, then you don't pay anything. And another pro of Ravelry is that they actually do the taxes for you. So once a month you get a bill for all of the taxes to all of the different countries, and then you just pay it, and then you don't have to do anything else, which is really nice. So one of the pros of Ravelry is actually that it's a database, and it's probably the biggest database there is for knitting and crochet patterns. So everybody knows it, I think, and a lot of people use it. But this is actually also one of the downsides of Ravelry, because it's a database. Everything that is put on there stays there. So if you've released a pattern and you want to delete it, that's not possible. And that also means that Ravelry is incredibly crowded. There are, I think, millions of patterns on Ravelry, so it's going to be tricky to release a pattern without, like, for example, already a social media following and then just hope that somehow it does well. That's just not very realistic, sadly. Then another one of the cons is that you don't really have any branding options. So on Ravelry, for example, this is how my page looks. You only really see the photos that I have of my designs, and there's no personal branding, there's no domain name, so it's just Ravelry. There's also no possibility for email marketing. And then lastly, when I go into my statistics, I can only see the monthly sales that I've done. I cannot find any other information that I could use to see how I'm doing, and that's not a lot. So then the next option that I think a lot of people gravitate towards, and that I also have a shop at, is Etsy. So Etsy actually takes 20 cents per listing. So every time that something is sold, you pay 20 cents. And then on top of that, you also pay 6.5% transaction fees. So one of the pros of Etsy is that it's a marketplace. So actually Etsy can bring a lot of customers to your store without having to have a following already. So like I said, with Ravelry, it's nice to have a following already so that you can send your followers to Ravelry. But with Etsy, you don't really need that because it's a marketplace. Then some of the cons about Etsy is, again, there's no branding, there's no domain name. You're just on Etsy and the whole page looks like Etsy, basically. Then there's also no email marketing, and the analytics of Etsy, they only show the sales and the conversion rate, and you don't get a lot of information about the customer. You only get a little bit of information about people that have favored your item or are following your shop, and nothing really besides that. Then the next platform that you can use is one that is if you want to make things a little bit more professional, which is Shopify. I've actually had a Shopify store where I would sell ready-to-wear clothing or like made-to-order clothing, and it was nice, but I also don't regret quitting my Shopify store, and I will explain why in a second. First of all, it is based on a membership, so it costs $30 a month, and then on top of that you also pay transaction fees, which are 2.9% plus 30 cents on each transaction. So one of the obvious pros about having a Shopify, in my opinion, is that you have your own domain name and then also your own branding, your logo. They do have a bunch of themes, but in my case I didn't really like all of the themes that they had, and I ended up buying one from Etsy. Then another pro I would say is that you can connect a Google Pixel and also your Facebook Pixel, so that will give you a lot of insights on analytics and customers. But then there are also a couple of cons. So you will need to bring your own traffic and customers to Shopify, so you will need to have a following from somewhere to be able to get people on your website, or you need to start advertising. Then I do think it's also quite expensive because you're paying the $30, and on top of that you're still paying transaction fees that are quite high. And then you also need to do your own taxes, which I guess is normal with a business, but it's quite nice, for example, like I mentioned earlier, that Ravelry does that for you. So those are 3 options where you can start selling your knitting patterns. But there is actually one more that you can try out that is probably the best of all, and I've tried to look for a con about this platform and I really could not find one. So I'm incredibly happy and excited to share that this video is actually sponsored by Payhip. And Payhip is actually a really nice platform where you can sell digital patterns, but you can also sell physical products amongst a bunch of other things that I will talk about later. One of the best things about Payhip is actually that it's free, and you can just have a free membership or account for however you like, for like any length of time. The only thing with a free account is that you have higher transaction fees, so the transaction fees are 5%. But do keep in mind that you can actually get a subscription for $30 a month, and then your transaction fees are only 2%. So that is actually already lower than Shopify, and with the free account, the transaction fees are also lower than Etsy, so that's really amazing. But despite being free, it gets even better because you can make your own house style, and you can also connect your own domain name for free. So you can do all of the branding, you can have your own website. Like, I don't understand how this is free. It's really amazing. And then Payhip also does your taxes in the EU and in the UK. I'm not sure how it is for the US, but for me, they will actually do the taxes for me for all of my digital patterns, which is really amazing. Now, speaking more about the branding and having your own house style. So this is how the store builder looks. I'm just starting it up, and then here you can see how it works. You just click on something and then you can easily adjust the text and change the fonts and everything. So for example, when I go back and scroll all the way down, I can change the style of my store. And here I can change the colors, the fonts, the buttons, everything. So I will be changing the font just to show you how many options there are. Then you can also easily add a new section to your website. So for example, you can do a gallery, a slideshow. You can have a featured product or collection. You can have a video. Then you can also have your featured blog post there, which is really interesting. And then here you can actually see some of my analytics. And as you can see, it does not only show the sales and conversion, but also the customer location, which I think is really nice. And there's actually the possibility also connect a Google Pixel or Facebook Pixel to track your customers even more. And like I mentioned earlier, you can sell digital products, but also physical products using Payhip. But there are actually more possibilities, which I think is really incredible, especially as digital products, you have to sell so many to be able to make like a decent amount of money. So being able to offer other things and get income streams besides that is really amazing. So for example, you can sell online courses, coaching, memberships. Then there's also the possibility of protecting your digital downloads with, for example, having a couple of download limits, and also with PDF stamping, which is something that Ravelry and Etsy or Shopify don't have. And you may have seen on the internet that a lot of things get stolen. So it's really nice to have this. On top of all of that, there are also some really awesome marketing tools. So you can blog, you can run affiliate programs, and you can also have email marketing, which is something that I was really missing on Etsy and Ravelry. You can subscribe to my emails and get notified of all of my test knit calls, promotions, new pattern releases, and I just think that's a really nice way to connect with people, and especially for people that really like your style, it's really nice to be able to offer this and kind of create a sense of community feeling. And finally, Payhip actually recently released their online marketplace. So like I mentioned earlier, for example, Etsy and Ravelry, you don't need to have an existing following to already start selling patterns. But now Payhip has solved that issue as well. So they have a marketplace where you can find a bunch of digital patterns, sewing patterns, crafting, like knitting patterns, of course. So even if you're just starting out, you can get your patterns on the marketplace for extra visibility. There's no extra cost, there's nothing extra that needs to happen. And I think that's such an amazing feature of them to have. So basically, as I've made probably abundantly clear, is that Ravelry, Etsy, Shopify is okay. But Payhip has basically solved all of our issues and created a marketplace that combines so many things, so you can have your own domain, your own house brand and logo style, your own platform, your own email marketing. You can have everything basically for nothing. Literally, you don't pay anything. So naturally, I am super happy and super grateful that Payhip wanted to collab with me for this video. And I think it's such an amazing platform. I've tried it out for myself and you can see it in the link in my bio. But also, there's also the link that you can get started with Payhip. And I would 10 out of 10 recommend, probably, if I knew about Payhip before starting my Etsy, I probably would never have started my Etsy in the first place. I would have just jumped straight to Payhip. That's how amazing I think it is. And I'm super happy also to have my domain name back, because after I quit my Shopify, I didn't have my domain name online anymore. And now mipithelabel.com is something again, and that's super nice as well. I really hope that you enjoyed this video and that it was helpful for you. Please like and subscribe, and also make sure to check out Payhip in the link in my bio. And for now, I wish you all a very happy day, happy knitting, good luck on your pattern journey, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye bye!